The beam of my headlamp sliced through the absolute blackness, wildly swinging as I stumbled over roots and unseen obstacles. My breath hitched, not from exertion, but from a cold, primal terror that had seized my chest. The snapping branches behind me weren't the wind, and the heavy thudding footsteps weren't my own echo. Every nerve ending screamed for me to run faster, deeper into the unforgiving forest, even though I had no idea where I was going. I risked a glance over my shoulder, catching nothing but fleeting shadows and the impenetrable wall of trees, yet the feeling of being hunted intensified, a palpable weight on my back. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that whatever was back there was gaining on me. It all started with an itch for solitude, a longing to disconnect from the relentless hum of city life. I'd always been drawn to the untouched wilderness, the kind where cell service dies a quiet death and the only notifications are the rustle of leaves or the call of a distant bird. This particular trip, a solo deep woods camping expedition into the vast, lesser-known stretches of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, was meant to be my sanctuary. I'd spent months planning, poring over topographical maps, researching the best gear, and meticulously packing everything I needed for a week off the grid. The promise of pure, unfiltered nature was an irresistible siren song, a return to something ancient and pure. I arrived at the trailhead mid-morning, the air crisp and carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. My pack felt heavy but familiar, molding comfortably to my shoulders as I began the 8-mile hike to my chosen secluded spot. The first few hours were bliss. Towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks formed a cathedral overhead, dappling the forest floor with shifting patterns of light and shadow. The only sounds were my boots crunching on fallen leaves and the distant chirping of unseen birds. It was exactly what I'd imagined, a perfect escape. My destination was a small, unmarked clearing next to a winding creek, far from any established trails or known campsites. I discovered it on an old forestry map, a tiny green patch tucked away in a remote corner. The sense of being truly alone, completely off the grid, was exhilarating. I paused often, taking deep breaths, letting the silence soak into my bones. There's a particular kind of peace that only comes when you know you're the only human for miles around. By mid-afternoon, I reached the clearing. It was even more beautiful than I'd hoped, a soft bed of moss and pine needles, encircled by ancient trees, with the clear creek gurgling gently nearby. I set about establishing my camp with practiced efficiency. First, the tent, carefully oriented to catch the morning sun. Then, I gathered kindling and larger logs for a campfire, a crucial act of both comfort and survival in the wilderness. I'm a big believer in leave no trace principles, so my fire ring was a small, contained affair, designed to vanish without a trace once I left. I spent an hour or so exploring the immediate vicinity, checking the water source, and admiring the sheer scale of the trees around me. There was a particular landmark I noted, a massive, fallen log, almost entirely swallowed by moss, that formed a natural bench overlooking the creek. This would be my morning coffee spot, I decided. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple, a change in the atmosphere became noticeable. The light grew softer, the shadows lengthened, and the vibrant sounds of daytime birdlife began to quiet, replaced by a different, more subdued chorus. The air grew cooler, carrying a sharper scent of moisture from the creek. This transition, from day to dusk, is always my favorite part of deep woods camping. It's when the forest truly comes alive in a new, mysterious way. I had a small fire going, its flames dancing against the deepening twilight, and I was preparing a simple meal of dehydrated pasta. The crackle of the fire and the gentle murmur of the creek kept me company, a comforting symphony of nature. It was then, as I stirred my dinner, that I felt it, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a prickle on the back of my neck. It wasn't a chill from the cooling evening, but something akin to the feeling of being watched. I dismissed it as paranoia, a natural side effect of isolation. Humans aren't meant to be truly alone for long stretches, and the mind can play tricks. I scanned the tree line around my camp. Nothing but the familiar, dark silhouettes of pines against the fading light. No rustling, no snapping twigs, just the steady hum of insects awakening for the night. Yet the feeling persisted, a subtle hum beneath my skin. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe a bear getting ready to bed down. Wildlife was abundant here, and it was hardly unusual for animals to be curious. I even spoke aloud, a habit I sometimes picked up when solo camping, just to hear a human voice. "Just me here, folks," I mumbled to the trees, a small, nervous laugh escaping my lips. The sound seemed to vanish instantly into the vastness of the forest, swallowed by the growing silence. This silence, I noticed, was different from the peaceful quiet of the afternoon. It felt heavier, more expectant. The usual nocturnal sounds, the hoot of an owl, the distant cry of a coyote, were conspicuously absent. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. This unnatural quiet was the first truly unsettling turn of the evening. I tried to focus on my dinner, spooning the warm pasta into my mouth, but my senses were on high alert. Every shadow seemed deeper, every branch seemed to twist into strange, suggestive shapes. I kept glancing up, my eyes sweeping the perimeter of my camp, searching for anything out of place. There was nothing, and yet there was everything. The feeling of being observed grew, transforming from a vague prickle into a definite, unwavering gaze. It wasn't the fleeting attention of an animal. This felt deliberate, intelligent. I thought I saw a faint movement behind a particularly thick old-growth fir, a flicker of something dark against the even darker bark. But when I stared, it remained still, just a shadow among countless others. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. The wind playing tricks with the branches, my eyes adjusting to the low light. I had been alone for hours, pushing myself physically. Maybe I was just tired. I finished my meal quickly, the warmth of the food doing little to dispel the growing chill in my bones. I packed away my cooking gear meticulously, scrubbing my pot with stream water and sand, ensuring no food odors would attract unwanted attention. I even double-checked the bear bag, strung high between two trees, a standard precaution that suddenly felt woefully inadequate. As true darkness descended, the small circle of light cast by my campfire became my only sanctuary, surrounded by an impenetrable wall of black. Above, the stars began to emerge, countless pinpricks of light in a velvet sky, but even their beauty felt distant and indifferent compared to the immediate, pressing darkness around me. I pulled out my book, hoping to distract myself, but my gaze kept drifting from the page. I found myself listening intently, unconsciously holding my breath, straining to pick up any sound beyond the crackle of the fire. The gurgle of the creek, which had been so soothing earlier, now seemed to undulate with an almost unsettling rhythm. It was a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound, and for a moment I imagined it wasn't just water. I imagined it was breathing. I shook my head, frustrated with my escalating paranoia. This was ridiculous. I was an experienced camper. I'd spent countless nights alone in the wilderness. This was just my mind manufacturing threats where there were none. Yet the conviction remained, unwavering, that I was not alone. The deep woods camping experience was taking an unsettling turn at dusk, far more than just the usual nocturnal awe. The fire, once a comforting friend, now seemed to cast too many dancing shadows, each one morphing into something vaguely menacing. I tried to focus on the warmth, on the familiar scent of wood smoke, but my senses were hyper-alert, tuned to the slightest deviation in the forest symphony. The subtle rustle of leaves that I had earlier dismissed as wind now seemed more deliberate, more localized. It was never directly in my line of sight, always just at the periphery, a fleeting movement that vanished the moment I turned my head. It was like trying to catch smoke, endlessly frustrating and deeply unsettling. I kept telling myself it was a squirrel, a rabbit, any small, harmless creature, but the movements felt too heavy, too purposeful for something so small. My heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic drum against my ribs. I decided to try and break the spell, to assert control over my environment. I grabbed my powerful LED flashlight, the kind that cuts through the darkest night, and systematically swept its beam across the tree line, moving slowly, deliberately. The light illuminated individual trunks, patches of moss, and the gnarled roots of ancient trees, but found no eyes reflecting back, no shape that didn't belong. The beam of light seemed to absorb the sounds of the forest, throwing them back as silence. For a moment, a brief, fragile moment, I felt a flicker of relief. See, nothing, just my imagination working overtime. I even scoffed aloud, a hollow sound in the vast quiet. Then, as the beam swung back across the darkest part of the forest opposite my tent, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible snap. It was the sound of a twig breaking, distinct and sharp, immediately swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. It wasn't the sound of an animal casually moving through the undergrowth. It sounded like someone stepping carefully, trying to be quiet but misjudging their footing. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, the flashlight beam locked on the spot where the sound had originated. My hands were clammy, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the warmth of the fire. I strained my ears, pushing past the frantic thumping of my own heart. Nothing, just the continued, heavy silence. I sat there paralyzed for what felt like an eternity, the flashlight still held aloft. After a few agonizing minutes when no further sound came, I slowly lowered the light, my eyes still darting between the shadows. My mind was scrambling for explanations, a branch settling, a rock shifting, anything but what my gut was screaming. But the sound had been too precise, too deliberate. This wasn't some random forest noise. This was a sound made by movement, careful movement, attempting to be silent. The unsettling turn of my deep woods camping trip was deepening into something truly sinister. I built the fire up higher, piling on more logs, hoping the increased light and warmth would act as a deterrent, a psychological barrier against whatever felt so present in the dark. The flames roared, casting erratic shadows that danced wildly across the surrounding trees, making it even harder to distinguish between real movement and optical illusions. I tried to convince myself that if someone or something was out there, they would have shown themselves by now or made a more definitive move. But the creeping dread wasn't leaving. It was tightening its grip. Then I heard it again. This time it was closer, a soft, rustling sound, like something brushing against low-hanging branches, followed by another faint snap. It came from a different direction than before, closer to the creek, almost directly behind my tent. My blood ran cold, the sheer audacity of it moving closer, circling me. This wasn't an animal. Animals generally avoid human camps, or at least they don't try to be stealthy like this. This felt predatory. I grabbed my small hatchet, the one I used for processing kindling, holding it tightly in my lap. It was a pathetic defense against an unknown threat, but it was all I had. I wanted to shout, to demand to know who was there, but the words caught in my throat. My voice felt too small, too weak against the vastness of the forest and the immense presence I felt lurking within it. Instead, I stood up slowly, keeping the campfire between me and the direction of the sounds. My eyes were wide, darting, trying to pierce the veil of darkness. The air felt heavy, charged with an invisible tension. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, making my hands shake. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I stood there for a long time, listening, my every nerve ending screaming. The sound stopped. The forest fell into an even deeper, more profound silence, as if whatever was out there knew I was listening, knew I was afraid. It was a silence that felt heavy, pregnant with expectation. This silence was worse than the sound. It was the silence of a hunter waiting for its prey to make a mistake. I knew I couldn't stay by the fire all night. Eventually, I'd have to retreat to the perceived safety of my tent. But the thought of turning my back on the unseen presence, of closing myself into a flimsy nylon shell, filled me with an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. I glanced at my tent, a small, brightly colored dome against the black backdrop of the woods. It looked utterly fragile, an inviting target. Every fiber of my being screamed that I should not get in that tent, but the cold was starting to seep into my bones, and exhaustion was beginning to set in. I decided to make one last, thorough sweep with my flashlight. This time, I moved away from the fire, slowly walking the perimeter of my camp, shining the powerful beam into every dark corner, every thicket. I focused on the ground, searching for footprints, anything that would give me a clue. The ground was predominantly covered in pine needles and moss, not ideal for leaving clear tracks, but I still hoped. As I moved around the edge of my campsite, my light swept across the fallen log I had noted earlier, the one I'd envisioned as my morning coffee spot. I paused, letting the beam linger, and then I saw it. It wasn't a footprint, not exactly. It was more disturbing. On the mossy surface of the log, where the moss was particularly thick and undisturbed, there was a series of depressions. They weren't clearly defined, but they were definitely there, too linear, too evenly spaced to be random. And they were long, too long for a deer, too narrow for a bear. They looked like finger marks, as if someone had pressed their hand down hard, then dragged their fingers along the mossy surface. And they were fresh. The moss was still slightly compressed, not yet sprung back. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic warning bell. This was absolutely not an animal. We're about to go deeper into this, and the story only gets darker from here. If you're enjoying this account and want to support the channel, take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now let's get back to it. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Someone or something had been here recently, close enough to touch my designated coffee spot. The marks were not old, not weathered. They looked as if they had been made within the last hour or two. My earlier rationalizations collapsed into dust. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't my imagination. There was definitely something out there, and it wasn't leaving. It had been watching me, perhaps for hours, from the cover of the ancient trees, observing my movements, waiting. The deep woods camping trip had become a terrifying game of cat and mouse, and I was the mouse. My mind raced, trying to process the information to make sense of the illogical. Who would be out here this far from any trail at dusk? And why were they hiding? Why the silence? If it were another camper, surely they would have announced their presence, exchanged greetings. No, this felt different. This felt wrong. The marks on the log were not just an indication of presence. They felt like a message, a deliberate sign that I was not alone, that I was being watched. My spine tingled with a cold dread. The air suddenly felt colder, despite the roaring fire. I knew then that I had to make a decision. Pack up and leave in the dead of night, navigating unfamiliar terrain in pitch black, or stay and face whatever was out there. Neither option felt safe. The thought of hiking out in the dark, vulnerable and exposed, was almost as terrifying as staying in a tent that offered no real protection. But the idea of spending the night passively waiting for whatever was out there to make its move, that was unbearable. My hand tightened on the hatchet, my knuckles white. The deep forest had become a cage, and I felt hunted. The decision crystallized in my mind with a terrifying clarity. I had to move. Staying put, waiting to be ambushed, was not an option. The deep woods camping trip had officially become a desperate struggle for survival. I needed to get out of the clearing, away from the perceived safety of my fire, which now felt like a beacon, announcing my presence. My plan, such as it was to quickly pack the absolute essentials: water, my headlamp, a basic first aid kit, and my sat phone. Though I knew service was nil here, it was a psychological comfort. And then move deeper into the forest, away from my established camp, hoping to create enough distance to be overlooked, or at least to gain some time to think. It was a risky gamble, moving into unknown territory in the dark, but it felt less like surrender than staying in my tent. My movements were swift and silent. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, sharpening my senses, pushing away the exhaustion. I doused the fire with water from the creek, the sudden hiss and plume of steam momentarily illuminating the darkness. before plunging the area into an even deeper blackness. The dying embers still glowed faintly, a last mournful pulse of warmth. I grabbed my pre-packed small dry bag, slung it over my shoulder, and clipped the hatchet to my belt. The headlamp, its beam a stark, artificial tunnel in the vast dark, became my only guide. I took one last, lingering look at my tent, a ghost in the darkness, a decoy left behind. I moved away from the clearing, trying to be as quiet as possible, stepping carefully over roots and undergrowth. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, sent a jolt of fear through me. My eyes constantly darted into the oppressive darkness beyond the headlamp's beam, searching for any sign, any movement. I held my breath, listening, but the forest was utterly silent now, save for the frantic thumping of my own heart in my ears. The silence itself felt like a presence, an invisible shroud that muffled every sound except my own panicked breathing. It was a terrifying symphony of nothing. I had only moved about 50 yards when I heard it, a distinct thud. It came from the direction of my camp, deep and heavy, as if something large had landed on the ground. Then, a series of softer, shuffling noises, followed by a faint, metallic clink. It sounded like my camp was being investigated. My blood ran cold. Whatever was out there had moved in on my tent. The realization that I was no longer the one being watched, but that my belongings were being tampered with, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I imagined hands tearing at the fabric of my tent, rifling through my gear, searching for me. The idea that someone was actively going through my things so close by was sickening. I wanted to run, to sprint headlong through the trees, but I knew that would only draw more attention. I forced myself to move slowly, deliberately, putting one foot in front of the other, trying to get as far away as possible. The terrain was uneven, treacherous in the dark. I stumbled, scraped my knee, but barely registered the pain. My only focus was escape, to put distance, any distance, between myself and whatever was at my camp. I pushed through thickets of undergrowth, felt branches whip against my face, but I kept going, deeper and deeper into the forest, hoping to lose myself in its impenetrable depths. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, I stopped to catch my breath. I found myself in an even denser part of the woods, where the canopy was so thick that even the faint starlight couldn't penetrate. It was absolute, suffocating darkness, broken only by the narrow beam of my headlamp. I turned off the light for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, hoping to gain some night vision, but it was useless. The darkness was too profound. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. I leaned against a rough tree trunk, trying to steady my racing pulse. I strained my ears again. Nothing. Just the wind sighing faintly through the distant treetops, a mournful, almost human sound. Then I heard it. Not a sound from my camp this time, but from somewhere closer. A very faint, guttural growl. It was low, almost imperceptible. Something felt more than heard, reverberating through the ground, vibrating in my bones. It was too deep for a coyote, too prolonged for a bear. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated menace. My stomach lurched. Whatever was in the deep woods was not just curious, it was hostile. I didn't wait. I turned my headlamp back on, its beam a desperate lifeline, and started moving again, faster this time, abandoning any pretense of silence. The growl had solidified my terror. This was no longer a game of stealth. This was a chase. I pushed through the tangled undergrowth, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches like grasping arms. I focused only on the light, on the small circle of illuminated ground ahead, willing my legs to keep moving. The deep woods forest became a terrifying labyrinth. Suddenly, I heard it again, much closer this time. The rapid rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches, heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth behind me. It was undeniable. Something was actively pursuing me. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. I risked a glance over my shoulder, catching nothing but fleeting shadows and the impenetrable wall of trees, yet the feeling of being hunted intensified, a palpable weight on my back. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that whatever was back there was gaining on me. I ran blindly, adrenaline my only fuel, my mind a jumble of primal fear. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. The sounds behind me grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't running like a human. It was too fast, too fluid, covering ground with an unnatural ease. And there was a distinct, rhythmic thumping mixed in with the rustling, like heavy footfalls, but somehow wrong. Too heavy, too evenly spaced, almost like a powerful stride. I still had no idea what it was, and the not knowing made it infinitely worse. The deep woods camping trip had culminated in a horrifying chase. I crashed through a dense thicket, stumbled and fell hard, my headlamp flying off and rolling into the undergrowth. Darkness, absolute and suffocating, swallowed me whole. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I scrambled on my hands and knees, desperately searching for the light, my fingers tearing at the damp earth and leaves. The sounds of pursuit were now terrifyingly close, just feet away. I could hear heavy breathing, coarse and ragged, not human, and a low, guttural chuffing sound, like a predator closing in on its prey. My hand brushed against the headlamp. I grabbed it, fumbling frantically to turn it back on. As the beam flickered to life, cutting a narrow path through the black, I looked up. Standing just beyond the reach of the light in the deepest shadows was a shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, and broad, silhouetted against the slightly less deep blackness of the trees behind it. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer. It was something bipedal, standing upright, but its form was wrong, too elongated, too gaunt, with an unnatural stillness that radiated pure malevolence. Its head was angled unnaturally, as if it were observing me with a bizarre curiosity. But it had no discernible features, just a darker shadow within the dark, like a hole in reality. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its outline shimmering slightly in the distorted light from my shaking headlamp. The heavy, ragged breathing was coming from it. My mind screamed, trying to rationalize it, to make it into something known, but it defied all categorization. A primal fear, deeper than anything I'd ever known, gripped me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. We were locked in a terrifying tableau, predator and prey. Then slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward, its movement fluid and silent despite its immense size. Another step, and another, each one closing the distance between us. The guttural chuffing sound started again, a low, ominous rumble in its chest. I could feel the vibrations in the air, a physical manifestation of its dark intent. My fight-or-flight response finally kicked in, overriding the paralysis of fear. With a guttural cry of pure terror, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, ignoring the pain, ignoring the tearing branches, the uneven ground. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to get away. The deep forest had become a nightmare. The sounds of pursuit were right behind me, a relentless, terrifying presence that filled the night. My mind was blank except for the burning need to escape. I heard a loud crack, startlingly close, like a tree branch being snapped in half, and then another, followed by a guttural roar that pierced the night. It was a sound of frustration, of pure, terrifying power. I pushed through one last thicket, stumbled, and found myself falling down a short, steep embankment, tumbling through loose soil and roots. I landed hard at the bottom, my body screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. I crawled forward, dragging myself through the undergrowth until I felt an open space. I had fallen into a shallow ravine, a natural depression that offered a small measure of concealment. I pressed myself against the damp earth, covering my head with my arms, my body shaking uncontrollably. The sounds above me continued, the crashing and rustling, but they seemed to be directly overhead now, searching. I could hear the heavy breathing, closer than ever. I held my breath, wishing myself invisible, wishing this was all a terrible dream. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sounds above me slowly receded, eventually fading into the distance. I lay there, trembling, for a very long time, until the sheer exhaustion of my ordeal finally began to claim me. I didn't know if it had given up or if it was just waiting, watching from further away. I didn't know if I was safe or if this was merely a temporary reprieve, but I knew one thing with chilling certainty. I was never, ever going deep woods camping again. It's been months since that night, but the deep woods haven't released their grip on me. Sleep is a fragile thing, often shattered by the sudden, vivid replaying of that terrifying chase. The profound silence of the forest at dusk, the specific snap of twigs, the guttural, inhuman growl, these sounds are etched into my memory, ready to surface at the slightest provocation. I still jump at shadows, flinch at unexpected noises, and the thought of being alone, truly alone, sends a shiver of dread through me. The world outside feels too small, too safe, yet the wild, untamed places now fill me with a deep, paralyzing fear. I never went back for my gear. My tent, my backpack, everything I left behind in that clearing remains there, a memorial to a night that stole a piece of my peace. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, whatever it was, lingering around my abandoned camp, perhaps even in the ravine where I hid, waiting. I no longer seek solitude in the wilderness. Instead, I find myself seeking crowded places, the background hum of human existence, a desperate comfort against the memory of that suffocating quiet. The deep woods changed me, leaving an indelible mark. I survived, yes, but I didn't escape unscathed. The unknown entity, the shadow with no features, it still feels like it's out there, somewhere, in the vast, dark emptiness of the forest, waiting for another unsuspecting soul to venture too far into its domain. Or perhaps it's closer than I think, always just beyond the periphery of my sight. If you've ever had an experience like this, or anything that made you question what truly lurks in the wild, I'd be interested to hear your stories in the comments below. Sweet nightmares.